Afghanistan. War in the Hindu Kush. A war fought by the Soviet Union to prevent the spread of Islamic fundamentalism. Like Vietnam, a conflict dominated by the helicopter gunship. Unlike Vietnam, a hit-and-run guerrilla war, not all rebels could agree how to win. And one fought in often atrocious conditions for which the Soviets were untrained and unprepared. Afghanistan is a remote, landlocked country whose closeness to Iran's Islamic Revolution scared the Kremlin. It's also a wild, mountainous country with few metal roads. This lack of easy communications dictated a two-pronged invasion to secure the capital, Kabul, and the towns along the road system. The invasion was personally supervised by Marshal Sergei Sokolov, the Soviet's deputy defense minister. Extensively experienced as a wartime tank general, he was a hawkish commander, but a conservative tactician who soon faced a federation of 24 major guerrilla groups. 1,800 T-62 tanks transported from the plains of Soviet Turkestan to the edge of the Hindu Kush Mountains. It's New Year 1980, and a Soviet army occupies a neighboring country. This was the limited contingent of Soviet forces in Afghanistan, the 40th Army, numbering 80,000 men now, but rising in time to 152,000, one-third the strength of United States forces at their peak in Vietnam. Over 2,000 armored fighting vehicles now began to make their presence felt on Afghanistan's few roads. More effective were the Mi-8 helicopter gunships, which would soon become symbolic of this war. On land, though, the Soviets entered Afghanistan completely unprepared for the conflict that developed, with the wrong organization and unsuitably heavy weapons. They said they'd been invited in to repel foreign intervention after a coup. In truth, President Hafizullah Amin was killed in his Darul Aman palace, not by Afghans, but by Soviet special forces, the Spetsnaz. His crime had been pushing reform too quickly, making a traditionalist Soviet ally vulnerable to Islamic revolution. But even as they established radio communications, the message was getting back that this would be no easy intervention. The problem was the Afghan army, already demoralized by rebel attacks since communists seized power 2 years earlier. As the New Year blizzards swept in, so did the realization that this army was close to collapse. Now, the Soviets were forced onto the offensive as resistance grew sharply. This deeply traditional and xenophobic people, already alienated by Afghanistan's communists, grew more hostile because the new regime proved totally dependent on a foreign power. Many fled the towns to join the resistance and fight the invaders, the total exodus soon numbering hundreds of thousands. A major target would be the Soviets' main supply route to Kabul as it twisted through the Salang Pass and tunnel. This 3-kilometer structure was built to shelter the road from avalanches, but vulnerable to sabotage and ambush. But already split by tribes, the Mujahideen were soon divided further by rivalries for foreign patronage in money and weapons. They began with rifles last used against the British a century before, Lee Enfields, some made in Pakistan. There in the border town of Peshawar, a busy cottage industry sprang up as gunsmiths opened tiny workshops to make exact copies of all sorts of firearms. United States funding paid for firearms orders of up to 30,000 weapons at a time. Salesmen eagerly demonstrated their copies of the British Sten gun, stored over racks of reproduction Lee Enfield rifles. Some weapons were more ingenious, like this firearm disguised as a walking stick. Several government officials would be assassinated in Afghanistan's capital. They also displayed captured Soviet weapons, especially the heavy machine guns, central to many a Mujahideen attack. But most popular of all were the Kalashnikovs, known as Kalikovs by the rebels, who swore to fight or die.
We want to fulfill our duties, and if we are killed, we are killed in the way of God Almighty. So we haven't lost anything. It's a victory by itself. So we are determined to fight to the last.
The resistance concentrated much of its efforts close to the border with Pakistan, where Peshawar offered sanctuary and supplies. The Salang Pass and the Panjshir Valley saw concentrated action by Mujahideen groups reinforced along several key border routes. In early 1980, the Mujahideen resistance controlled 90% of the countryside, though popular outrage at the invasion provided more volunteers than they could arm. Most remained locally based, however, rarely communicating with other groups or operating outside their own valleys. The Dushmans, as the Soviets called the Mujahideen, would be slow to develop sophisticated strategies going beyond simple hit-and-run tactics. Helicopter patrols were one hazard of infiltration in these border valleys. Skilled at evasion, these Mujahideen could regard the interruption as a welcome rest on the arduous trek across the Kunar Valley. With no jungles or marshes to conceal movement, they took pride in their ability to melt into crevices in the craggy landscape. This simple craft gave them domination of the area. A Soviet armored patrol negotiates the rough valley road. Heavy armor frequently spearheaded divisional raids on rebel mountain strongholds, until the Soviets realized that they often lacked the gun elevation to engage the Mujahideen, yet remained vulnerable to rebels' rocket-propelled grenades. The destruction of villages and a series of Soviet offensives sharply depopulated the valleys. Here in the Panjshir, up to 50,000 people fled their homes, moving 80 kilometers into the high valleys, 3,000 meters up in the mountains. With no homes, many were reduced to living in caves. Mujahideen infiltrating along the river found that, with work stopped on the land, food supplies were badly disrupted. And they already faced natural hazards that divided Mujahideen groups one from another. The logistics of moving men and munitions under these conditions severely handicapped the ability of many rebel groups to stage sustained operations. Patrolling helicopters had another role too. Thousands of butterfly anti-personnel mines were dropped to disrupt Mujahideen movements. Soviet strike jets added their firepower, called in here in retaliation for a Mujahideen ambush. But it was usually the villages that suffered, not the rebels. In a lull, they move on towards another objective. Unlike the Viet Cong, which was created to fight a guerrilla war in South Vietnam, the Afghan resistance had grown spontaneously, but it lacked the unifying equivalent of a Vo Nguyen Gia with practical battle experience. And this lack of a central command prevented strategic planning and the efficient use of resources. Mujahideen lay an ambush in the strategic Salang Pass. Most understood the shock value of the ambush, relying on it as their basic tactic.
Background cover, background cover.
They were reasonably good at this form of action, usually targeting oil convoys as they hurried south to Kabul. This time, Afghan troops, whose lorry has been stopped, prepare to surrender. The Mujahideen order them to throw down their weapons. A shaven head indicates a young conscript. If he doesn't join the rebels, he'll be escorted to a Pakistani refugee camp. In their war of the roads, the Mujahideen destroyed thousands of trucks along this vital supply route, causing severe fuel shortages in the capital. A glance at the instruction book and two rebels prepare to launch a rocket attack. In this most casual of strikes, rockets were aimed merely by being propped against rocks and fired by wires stuck to the casing with airstrip. This haphazard approach meant that sometimes the effects were simply a nuisance.
1, 2, 3.
Sometimes they hit civilian areas. But they also hit the airport, disrupting the Soviet Union's vital air links. And burning fuel meant that more convoys would have to run the gauntlet of the now infamous Salang Pass. But the most spectacular result of one of these hit-and-run raids was the strike on a SAM missile dump at Karga, just outside Kabul. 40 people were killed as the long crescendo of explosions devastated the site. The Soviets denied it was the result of a rebel attack, but later took steps to improve security. After 20 minutes, the massive series of explosions grew to a climax. The approaches to Anava, an important Soviet-Afghan base in the Panjshir Valley. It was from here that counterinsurgency measures were planned and carried out. Heavily bunkered, their defensive attitude soon became regarded as a drain on manpower, so Afghan troops were given a greater part as Soviet thoughts turned gradually to withdrawal. And Afghanistan's often miserable weather sapped the morale of the troops charged with mounting those sweeps.